Hello, guys. This is your host Vikas again with another very interesting podcast. This is episode number 18, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Mr. Jason Koop on the show. Jason is the head coach for CTS Ultrarunning, and you might find him very familiar if you are in the ultrarunning space. He's the author of Training Essentials for Ultrarunning, again, extremely popular book for ultramarathon training. During his coaching career, he has managed over 100 endurance coaches and several hundred athletes of all types, abilities, and sports. He is coached to many of today's top ultramarathon athletes in the world, including Dylan Bowman, Casey Lectide, Timothy Olson, Stephanie Voilet, Dakota Jones, Kelly Wolf, and many others. He is also an accomplished ultra runner himself, having completed some of the most difficult foot races in the world, including Badwater 135, Hard Rock 100, Leadville 100, Bear 100, Western States 100. Too many 100-milers, isn't it? And if you know about ultra running, you know how difficult these races are, and these are almost like an aspiration for people to participate and eventually complete. In today's conversation, like I said earlier, we are going to talk about how to get faster. Isn't it very interesting topic? It always fascinates me. You always want to improve your paces regardless of where you are. And so hopefully from today's conversation, you will pick up a thing or two that you can leverage for your training. And why I think it's very important is because it's coming from a huge training experience of Jason, of he training for more than 20 years, and he's bringing all of that to you in about 45 minutes. Let's not wait a lot and welcome Jason to the show. But before that, I'm not sure if you know, but Jason runs a very famous podcast in the US. It's called Koop. You should look it up and you'll enjoy his conversations with some of the leading researchers, exercise scientists, coaches, and doctors. Okay, so let's not delay more and welcome Jason to the show. Jason, welcome to the podcast. This is great to have you.
I'm excited to be here.
I'm a fan of Koopcast. It is outstanding.
I never thought in my entire life I would have fans. So thank you for that. I'm honored.
It is awesome. I mean, almost all my runs have one of your sessions. I look forward to it. Dr. Sean Bearden and yours are two of my most favorite,
Thank you for
and
that.
it's just amazing.
Thank you for that. I appreciate it.
So, in today's discussion, we wanted to cover a lot around how to get faster when you run. And from your coaching experience, I thought you'll be able to bring a lot of value to it. Our listeners are primarily runners who do marathons or shorter distances than a marathon. And we will keep that target group in mind as we're discussing. So, this is the topic majorly I wanted to cover today. And I thought, how about we get started with that? How does one get faster through training or anything else, in your opinion?
Well, it's really through the adaptive process that's elicited through the training volume and the training load that you're able to apply to an athlete. But really, I think the way that athletes should think about this is it's driven through the adaptive responses, which those in turn are driven through how much training load you can apply. And that sounds like a little bit of an esoteric answer to people who are just kind of getting into the sport, but you can think about training load as having two primary components. The first one is training volume, and most people will consider training volume miles. I would define it by time, but for this discussion, either one is fine. And then the second component is training intensity. Some combination of that, volume and intensity that you're doing throughout the course of your running, that's ultimately how you get faster at a very fundamental level. You have to apply a load that is difficult enough for your body to say, "Hey, the next time that this happens, I want to be bigger, stronger, faster, have more of the cellular machinery so that that load isn't as taxing as it was the last time I did it. You apply that load, you give the body a little bit of time to rest, the body adapts, and then you become faster. Um, a lot of times people think that the only way to get faster is to actually run faster. And while there's a component of that is true because that's one of the 2 variables that I mentioned, volume and intensity. You can also get faster just by simply running more. And in fact, with most, beginner athletes, people who are just coming into the sport, they have a lot of room to improve just by doing more and more low intensity volume. They will get faster as a mere byproduct of adding training load just with volume, right? Not with intensity, as I was saying earlier. Those two components, those two key components being volume and intensity. They'll get better just on the volume side initially, which is a really interesting paradigm, I think, for a lot of entry level athletes to kind of initially wrap their head around.
Right. So let's open this threadbare and we start from the very basic. Say I'm an absolute beginner. I'm starting to train for a marathon and I'm just getting started. Now, what is happening as I pick up running as a sport or as I start training for the race? You talked about volume. How does it really help? Let's just go through this a bit more in detail.
Sure. So the thing to think about as a beginner is any amount of training load is likely enough to elicit that adaptive response that I mentioned earlier because you're coming from an untrained state. So for a beginner, it's generally unnecessary to try to over contrive the situation with really perfect training architecture and all of these types of high intensity intervals that the elite athletes use and things like that. Beginner athletes, they just need to run and they just need to run and try to do it consistently 3 to 5 days per week. And it's almost a proposition where where it is success by lack of failure where you're going to improve automatically as a beginner as long as you don't screw it up and get hurt. And so I think the mindset that a lot of entry level athletes need to go through is that first and foremost, something is better than nothing, right? You go out and you haven't been running at all, you go out and run a couple of kilometers, and that's going to be enough to elicit the adaptive response. So something is better than nothing, and you can make small, gradual increases in the total amount of volume that you're doing per week. 1 week, I'm doing 3 days per week, and I'm running 3 or 5 kilometers and the next week I'm running 3 or 4 days per week and I'm running 5 to 8 kilometers, really small increments in that total amount of volume is really that is the fundamental key to success with any athlete just starting out is making these very small, gradual, consistent, incremental amounts of improvement or increases on the volume side. That ultimately is going to lead to a lot of adaptation.
Right. Very important. Now, as the athlete starts, the athlete also wants to keep seeing progresses, and this is a lot more relevant for newer athletes. They want to get faster almost every day, or they want to
Exactly.
they
Exactly.
they want to meet the pace that they did the last week or be better at it. They want to look better on Strava and things like those. Um, so now my question was that how early should people start to expect that their paces are getting better? Are they starting to feel possibly easy at the same pace as earlier? At what stage should they be seeing? Because in the first few weeks, they're only adapting to the feeling of running, the discomfort, the high they get after the run. Once they are over this, they start to go through some of these things and they want to experience some of these. At what stage is it realistic that they should start to see improvement in the speed or reduction in paces?
Well, if you are truly a beginner, so for the listeners out there that are currently not running or they're running let's just say 3 days a week for a minimum of 2 to 3 hours total during that week. We're going to lump all those into the beginner category just to put a box on it or on that user group. If you're truly a beginner, it's not going to take very long. 3 or 4 weeks at the very most, and once again, you don't have to have much, you just have to be doing a little bit more than what you're doing right now. So for the people that aren't running at all, just running a couple of hours per week, 20 minutes a day, 3 to 5 days per week, that's going to be enough for runners to initially get faster right away. Something is better than nothing. And a lot of times not trying to maximize things from the get-go for beginners is a way better strategy than thinking that you can all of a sudden start out and triple your volume or start doing 10-kilometer runs, 5-kilometer runs right from the get-go. So, if you really, really are a beginner, it really doesn't take that much, and that's one of the great things about running is that there is both an acute and a chronic response to training. The acute response happens within several days. There's a lot of these physiological adaptations that occur very, very, very quickly on the order of a few to several days. And beginner athletes can reap a lot of those rewards simply by running. There's also a chronic nature to adaptation. And this is also what's fantastic for even experienced athletes. So even if you've been training for 10 years, 20 years, or 30 years, you can leverage a lot of these chronic adaptations and over longer time frames, 3 to 4 months, you can still see incremental improvement with those athletes. So it's possible at either end of the spectrum. And once again, I think that uh, it's not an easy proposition, but we have to do a good job of making sure that entry level athletes or beginner athletes are taking on the right dose. And it does not take much. It simply has to be more than what you're currently doing today.
Got it. Okay, let's assume they spent first few weeks. They have either started to feel better or started to feel the same training paces easy, or they've been able to now run faster paces, and with the help of the volume that they've been putting over the weeks, they are improving. Do you think at this stage they should start to incorporate some of the speed workouts or not as yet?
Well, for somebody who is just getting into the sport, I really think that they would be best served to spend 3, maybe even 4 months just running at an easy intensity. And once again, they're going to improve just through that easy intensity through a lot of these acute physiological responses that are happening. And so there's really not a need if improvement is your end goal. And most people take on running because they like as you mentioned, they want to see themselves get a little bit faster. They're trying to complete their first half marathon or whatever. If improvement in getting yourself in the best physical shape is the end goal, there's really no need to add intensity for a beginner athlete once they reach kind of an asymptotic, that's my favorite word to use, by the way. Once they reach kind of the asymptotic part of their improvement curve, meaning their improvements that they're seeing week to week go from 10% to 2% to 1% really quickly, right? They start to fade off. That's the point at which you want to add in some intensity, not at the very beginning, because you can reap all these rewards in a really, time effective, but also from a risk management perspective, something that carries very low risk with it. So I don't think that athletes really need to even start beginner athletes even need to start to think about incorporating any speed work or any high intensity work until 3, 4, maybe even 5 months into the whole process.
Sure. The marginal rate of returns in terms of the speed improvements here, as you talked about, over a period of time, starts to reduce now, and whether it's a beginner or an experienced runner, they start to hit this plateau, and I've seen a lot of demotivation setting in. At that stage, how should people be really approaching it? Let's take possibly both end of the spectrum. So you talked about beginner runners in greater detail so far, specifically about the runners who have been intermediate, or they've been training for a few years and they are at a particular stage where they have started to plateau. It's the same pace, same speed that they've been running. One, to understand why this is happening, and once we've understood that, how do we go about addressing this so that they could start to get faster?
Yeah, this is a really interesting topic that I'm putting together some content on that'll be released sometime in the next few weeks. So it's all top of mind for me right now. I love First off, I love your analogy of marginal rate of returns. That shows your financial background there. Um, but you're absolutely right. As an athlete becomes more experienced, it's harder and harder to elicit further adaptations. And before we launch into this, here's a quick anecdote that I use with our coaches. So we have a coaching group of about 50 coaches. And one of my roles within that coaching group is to mentor a lot of our younger coaches as they're, getting their feet wet and learning the profession of coaching. And I always have to temper their expectations whenever they have a new athlete that is improving by leaps and bounds within the first 1 to 2 years. And I tell them that you better be getting improvements out of them, and you're getting improvements out of those athletes even despite yourself, even despite the fact that you might have screwed up this training design or this workout, or you didn't evaluate this correctly or whatever. The athlete is still going to improve because they're still relatively new to the sport, to kind of going back to one of my earlier points. Coaches really make their money after an athlete has about 4 or 5 years of experience. Um, that's when it gets that's when it gets markedly more difficult to squeak out further gains, and where it takes really smart training design and architecture. So I think that's important for athletes to keep in mind. And it's even from a coaching perspective, we see this developmental arc play out many times with athletes. So for the experienced athletes, the first thing that needs to happen, and all athletes go through this at some point in their career, the first thing they need to do is zoom the lens out. When athletes are beginners, they're used to looking at improvement, as we just mentioned, on the order of weeks, a few weeks at a time. I can look at the paces that I ran 2 weeks ago, and then now my paces are 10% faster or 5% faster or whatever. That's the lens that the athlete is looking through to gauge improvement, is a couple of weeks. When an athlete becomes more experienced, they first need to zoom that lens out to a few months. And that's a hard paradigm shift for a lot of athletes because everybody wants to see, like you just mentioned, everybody wants instant gratification on Strava,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And a lot of times when athletes get overly frustrated with a lack of progress, it's not the fact that they are not improving. It has everything to do with the fact that they're zoomed in too tight on what's going on day to day. Um, an interesting thing that, or an interesting way that athletes can think about this is, earlier I mentioned these adaptive processes that happen. You apply a certain amount of training load, then you remove that training load, and then you get better. That process of getting worse, right? Because if you just think about this, you're at your physiological worst immediately after a hard workout, right? You've just taxed yourself to your utmost ability. You're going to be running your slowest paces, your slowest performances, whatever it is, right after that workout is done. That's when you're at your worst. Some point after that, you're going to get better, right? You don't continue to get worse once you remove the stress. For beginner athletes, that increment is days and maybe weeks at the very most. But for more experienced athletes, that process takes months. So you need to continually apply training load day after day after day, and then remove the training load for a longer period of time, 3, 5, 7 days in the deloading phase. And then you get better. So the whole lens needs to get zoomed out. That's the very first thing. The second thing that more intermediate or advanced athletes need to start to consider in their training is this concept that in coaching that is known as periodization. And all that means is organizing your training into a logical sequence where you will continue to see improvements. There are There are a boatload of different, periodization schemes out there. Schemes always makes it sound like a Ponzi scheme or some sort of racket,
So
but it's
insurance scheme or something.
yeah, there you go. There are all different types of periodization models, I'll use
Yeah.
that word. There are all different types of periodization models that are out there, and they all work to a certain degree. Some of them work better than others, and I think that might be a little bit outside the scope of this, particular podcast. But going from no structure to some structure will always make a little bit of a difference. So that's the first fundamental training shift that an intermediate athlete needs to make is they need to put some type of logical organization behind their training, and that organization first looks at training on the order of months. What am I going to do this month? What am I going to do next month? What am I going to do the month after that? And then drills it down to the specifics. What am I going to do this week, next week, the week after that? And then drills it down even more specifics. What am I going to do tomorrow, the next day, the next day? So I think that that's what athletes can. I think those two things are what intermediate and advanced athletes can do to kind of continue this progress. Is you got to zoom the lens out first and realize that everything's just going to take a whole lot longer. And the second thing is you have to organize your training into some logical sequence that will give it some structure and flow.
Yeah, this makes a lot of sense to me. What I have seen in my experience that one, if people believe in the process, that what they are following through the training methodology they're going through, or a periodization model they have adapted to, that they trust and believe that it's going to take them there, there is a higher possibility that they are going to get better results than if they were not following it. And maybe this is at the stage where they could start to look at coaches, right? Take help from coaches if they're not getting better and they are self-training, they possibly start to look out for some of these experienced coaches like you talked about early on, that someone who is as experienced as having to be responsible for getting times improved, or having trained a number of people for a number of years, that could help as well, isn't it?
Well, belief and smart training design are greater than the sum of those individual parts. Meaning, if I can get 5% improvement out of an athlete with good training design, and then I can get another 5% out of an athlete by them wholeheartedly believing, that's worth 15% improvement. Those two things are worth greater than the sum of their individual parts because they feed off of each other. They increase the consistency, they increase the effort that you're going to put into all the hard workouts. You're able to have more confidence. So yeah, you're absolutely correct, 100% correct that belief becomes a big component in this whole process. So much so, and I see this all the time. Good athletes will continue to improve despite not having the best training structure because they believe in it so wholeheartedly. And we see this a lot in the coaching industry with coaches that just get on a they become popular simply because of some external factor. They had an athlete that, had a big win or whatever. When you peel when you peel the curtain back or you kind of pop open the hood on training, most a lot of times the training really isn't all that good. It's okay, but there's definitely better ways to do it. But because the athlete believes in it and it's kind of a logical structure, but maybe not the best structure, the athlete's still able to see a lot of that success because of that belief component.
Got it. How about we stay on this topic for a little longer and cover some other aspects? We talked about training volumes, we talked about the psychology, we talked about believing in the process, etc. How about we look at a couple of other variables that are extremely important as well? Let's start with the impact of body weight on your pace or speed. I've seen, of course, the beginners at times they get started on their training journeys primarily to lose fat or weight, but more advanced ones or the intermediate ones, that not necessarily is the case. But there's this question that always keeps coming, that how much role the body weight plays into deciding the speed for you. Do you think this is extremely important for people to understand at this stage?
I honestly don't. I don't put
Okay.
a r I mean, I'll just be frank with you. I don't put a lick of emphasis on that when I'm working with any athlete, even the most elite athletes. I use, the way that the way that body composition ends up being optimized, and I'm using the word body composition as opposed to weight very intentionally because those are 2 different. The way or the lens that I look at that through is through optimizing the day-to-day and in-workout nutrition. The weight and or the body composition will take care of itself as long as you're focused on the nutrition day to day being high quality and of adequate amounts, and the in-workout nutrition being of high quality and in the right amounts. So I've never well, I take that back. I've had one athlete that came to me who was very obese and he needed to lose over 150 pounds. And we had weight targets with that one particular athlete. And I'm talking about several hundred athletes that I've worked with over the course of my coaching career. But with that one exception, I've never used the term race weight or ideal weight or any of those terms with any athlete at any level, beginner level, intermediate level, and even the most elite athletes that I work with. So I quite frankly, I don't put a lot of or any, if that last statement is true, but I don't put any emphasis on the weight side of things. Yes, it does. Yes, it does impact performance. I realize that. I have a biomechanics background. I understand how weight impacts running economy and athletic performance and things like that. But from a coaching and a planning perspective, I think the right way that athletes should look at it is through creating healthy nutrition habits, not necessarily just trying to lower their body weight or improve their body composition. Work on the nutrition habits first and let the weight piece of it almost take care of itself as a second order effect almost.
Sure. Now that brings the other question around speed and pace. That is strength training. This is one question that there are two extreme end of discussions that happen. One set of runners, and including me, honestly, at certain on certain occasions, I do not want to be in the weight room. I do not want to be. I possibly want to be running on the treadmill, even if I'm in the gym. How do you look at that? And do you think SNC does play an important role in getting faster or not?
Well, it becomes a time proposition for most athletes. And I've had this disagreement and discussions with coaches ad nauseum for the last 20 years. You can go out and you can review all of the scientific literature on strength training and endurance performance. And overwhelmingly, it will show a positive correlation between when you incorporate strength training, you're going to get some additional running benefit. And we can slice and dice those benefits in a number of different ways. It's very, very well studied, I guess is the point that I'm trying to get out. However, it comes at an additional time cost and energy cost to the athlete. And so if the athlete has the capability of managing that extra time and energy cost, it could be a reasonable adjunctive training. How, but if you're removing run training stress in order to accomplish that, and I'm not just talking about time, right? I'm not just talking about, oh, I'm going to skip this run workout to do the strength training workout. If you're removing any sort of run training stress, it's compromising your ability to do hard workouts. You know, you literally have to remove a session or whatever. That's when the value proposition of strength training starts to deteriorate because even the most elite athletes only have so much time and energy to go around. And when you have a tool in your tool belt that is gonna produce very robust adaptations, which is running, right? That's the tool in your tool belt that will produce the most adaptations for a running event. It's just going out and running. You better be using that tool to exhaustion and then adding on other tools that could potentially help complement that. The way that I like to think about this is you're getting 98% of your improvement from running. 2% of it might be able to cut, and this is the percentage that the literature overwhelmingly has come to the consensus on about what you're going to get out of strength training, you might be able to improve an additional 2% with with intelligently designed strength training that does not compromise the running side of things. It's a lot of caveats, but it's intentional. Now, that's looking at strength training strictly through the lens of running performance. If you wanna do strength training just because you wanna be a healthier, more well-rounded individual, great, go do it. Like, you wanna be able to put a suitcase in the overhead bin without throwing your back out, you wanna play with your kids, and pick them up and things like that without, feeling like you're gonna injure yourself. You wanna use strength training as like a lifestyle adjunctive type of exercise, great, absolutely go ahead and do it. There's nothing wrong with that. There's a tremendous amount of health benefits to be gained from strength training. But if you look at it through the lens of improving running performance, we have to look at it very strategically and cautiously because the increments in performance are so small compared to the increments in performance that you get from just running.
Got it. I like to explain it in a way that um, strength training is more like supplement and not your main meal. If you start using your supplements as main meal, they're not going to be real replacement of main meals. You need to eat real food to be healthy and not only be reliant on supplements. I guess this is how I'm understanding here that if you want to do strength training because of um, one, of course, if you have time and you want to live a particular lifestyle, then it's good, but it should not be replacing your running as your main activity is what I'm getting at, right?
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I ascribe to that. I ascribe to that philosophy. And I have runners that participate in strength training programs and I have ones that don't. And every time we go through that process, it's a very deliberate one to identify the goals that you want to get out of the strength training program, as well as the time and energy cost of including that type of modality into it. I came from the background just as a personal story. I came from the background where a running training program inherently included strength training by default. Like, here's your run training program, and the strength training program has always been a part of that. And it took me about 5 or 7 years of coaching to, like, think about that and go, "Wait a minute, do we always need to be doing this?" And it's just because it's been passed down from coach to coach to coach. And so since then, I've just scrutinized the application of that strength training process through a much more strict lens and tried to look at it as a cost benefit way. What is the benefit that the runner is going to get out of it compared to the cost that it takes to get that benefit? And is it worth it for each individual? And with some runners, the answer to that is yes. And for other runners, it's very clearly no because they don't have the time, or like from a beginner perspective, you have so much to gain just by running, right? Just run. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that. And a lot of reasons beginner runners fail to they kind of like drop out of the program, right? They start training and they stop training is because they've made it too hard on themselves. They're trying to run, they're trying to stretch, they're trying to foam roll, they're trying to strength train, they're trying to, do 5 or 6 different things, and all they need to do is just run 3 days a week, and you're gonna improve, and you're gonna improve a lot if you just run 3 days per week for 3 months. That's gonna take you a really long way. You don't have to do all of these other things that unnecessarily complicate the whole situation. We could go on for forever for strength training. I mean, this is like oh my gosh, ad nauseum.
Okay, I'm going to ask another question about strength training though. How about its role in injury prevention, especially when people are right in the middle of their training? So for a marathon or such, their training loads are pretty high. It's said that if you include the strength training in your program, it either mitigates or reduces the risk of getting injured.
Okay, so, that's very good literature to bring up, and there's very commonly cited literature that says that strength training will reduce your susceptibility to injuries or reduce your injury rate, depending upon how they're actually looking at it, by anywhere between 20 and 50%. Use that as a number. I want everybody to remember it. 20 to 50%. That's a lot. That's a lot. I mean, don't get me wrong. Runners suck at remaining uninjured. We are horrible at it. So anything that can help that process is absolutely welcome. Um, However, and this is where the cost benefit comes in, if you look at impacts how rest impacts injury susceptibility, it's on the order of 500% if you just take one extra rest day per week. So when you look at an efficacious tool to help prevent injury, do you want to pick the one that has a 500% decrease in the susceptibility or a 50% decrease in the susceptibility? And don't get me wrong, yeah, don't get me wrong, strength training and rest are incompatible. Those 2 things do not mutually overlap. If you're gonna strength train, that is not rest. That is not a rest day. It might be a day off from running if you do strength training, but it's not a rest day. So, this goes back to the earlier point that I mentioned, that you always have to look at the cost benefit of the activity. You might not need a 500% decrease in your injury susceptibility rate. That might not be something you might not need that efficacious of a solution. And strength training might be a good way to prevent injury for those athletes. So my point with all of that is look at it through the lens of what's going to provide the most bang for your buck and kind of what do you actually need. I divide strength training. One of the I mentioned earlier that when we go through this process, or when I go through this process with athletes and trying to determine how they're actually going to use it, one of the components of that is, what are we trying to get out of the strength training? Are we trying to get are we trying to use strength training in an ergogenic sense, meaning it's going to enhance the performance? And primarily it does that through improved running economy. So your legs act like better springs, essentially. That's what strength training is doing. Or are we looking at strength training through this latter thing that we just started talking about, in terms of how do we use strength training to prevent injury? Now, there's a little bit of Venn diagram overlap between those two goals, but you can you if you wanted to take the extremes on either end, the programming looks markedly different. If you're using strength training in an ergogenic sense, you're doing heavy lifts, possibly explosive lifts. You're periodizing your strength training throughout the course of the year, just like you would periodize your running. And it is absolutely a big tax. I mean, it should be hard. All 80% of those strength training workouts should have some element of being difficult. So there's an impact to the whole training arc, I guess, is what the picture that I'm trying to paint. If you're using strength training primarily to prevent injuries, I like to the term that gets thrown out a lot in the physical therapy world, and the physical therapists hate this, so forgive me if there are any physical therapists listening to this, is corrective exercise training. And that is typically low load, not higher repetitions, but low, like a low training load. So it's easy. There's small movements. You're trying to correct, little movement inconsistencies and movement anomalies and things like that. There's typically not a training consideration for that, because it's not very hard, so to speak, or there's not much of a training consideration because it's not very hard. That type doesn't impact the run training as much. So you can get it away with incorporating it, and your only cost is time, and that's another thing, whether, you actually have the time to do those things or not. And so I keep coming back to my point that if we're going to use strength training with runners, we have to be deliberate about how we're doing it. And then through that deliberate process, we can design things that are more precise for each person.
Understood. Makes sense. So we covered a lot about strength training and its role for getting faster and injury prevention. We also talked about volume and intensities. How about one other variable? And in your opinion, do you think and you covered to some extent rest, but I wanted to cover more about sleep. And I wanted to understand specifically when people with their training loads, if they are also increasing their training intensities, do you think there is a role of sleep that comes in handy at this stage from your experience, what has been a better proposition that people, of course, who are well rested, they would be performing better, but is there minimum sleep they should be looking at? Is there a rest that they should be looking at differently, etc. at this stage?
Well, there's a little bit like anything else, there's a little bit of an individual component to that. But in general, athletes should be getting anywhere between 7 and 9 hours of sleep. In fact, when when we look at how to get athletes to recover optimally, this is a big area in coaching. We use these pneumatic compression boots and all these kinds of recovery shakes and massage and foam rolling, and you kind of name it, right? All of these modalities to enhance recovery. The thing that trumps them all is sleep. I mean, if you're not sleeping 7 to 9 hours a night and you're getting in your compression boots, that's a poor trade-off in terms of time management. So absolutely runners need to be getting more sleep. I don't think it needs to be any more during heavier training phases versus lighter training phases, as long as you're doing the basics to begin with. I think that it's one of these things where you just need to get your habits set up so that you're getting that quality 7 to 9 hours every single night. And then independent of how the training changes, you just keep that same base level essentially.
Got it. Makes sense. Okay, the last question I'm going to ask is around speed workouts. We did talk about intensities to some extent in the start, but do you suggest any type of speed workouts that help you in getting faster more than the other types, in addition to the easy runs, the long mileage load and things that we discussed already?
Well, for the beginner, I'm gonna really dodge this question because that's gonna take like another. I mean, training architecture is one of that's like my thing. If there's anything that's my thing, it's training design, both from a month-to-month standpoint and then also from a workout standpoint. Like that's just one of my calling cards from a coaching perspective. So I could go on and on and on about this. The first thing that I'll mention is that for beginner athletes, you don't have to overcomplicate it. Some intensity is going to be better than none, and it honestly doesn't matter what intensity you apply first. We can look at, intensities of 70% of VO2 max, 80% of VO2 max, 90% of VO2 max, 100% of VO2 max, percentage of lactate threshold, whatever. Some intensity is going to continue to facilitate the improvements as opposed to none. And it honestly, and I say this having a lot of professional skin in the game, it honestly doesn't matter what you apply to start out with. Now, for the intermediate to advanced athletes, I don't have a favorite. And that's because I know that all of them can be leveraged differently, utilized differently to elicit adaptations. I don't play favorites in this game. I'm not a VO2 max guy. I'm not a lactate threshold guy. I'm not a, zone two person or whatever. I realize how all of those different training intensities can work harmoniously within an athlete's schedule and that they should all be applied in certain proportions depending upon what the athlete's goal is. So I wish I had like a magical, solution for you, but I've just learned over the course of years that whenever you get too obsessive about one particular type of workout, you become blinded to how all of the other workouts can work in concert with each other. So I don't look at it through that lens anymore. The way that I look at training design now is that things have to go from general to specific. Meaning when you're far away from the race, let's just say you have 6 months to train for a race, you need to be doing the things that are probably the least like the race. So if you're doing a marathon, you're doing super high intensity stuff, right? You're doing speed work and 200-meter repeats on the track and things like that. Then as the race gets closer and closer, you're gradually tailoring that work such that it's more specific to the race. You're doing more of your runs at marathon pace, maybe a little bit faster. You're organizing it into intervals that are going to be close to marathon pace and things like that. And you can apply that strategy irrespective of what you're training for. You start out training the things that are least specific to the race, And then as the race starts to draw near, you end up training the intensity and everything else that is the most specific to the race. So rather than have one key workout, I think that's the better framework to work from.
I think that makes sense. Yeah, taking a more holistic approach and very specific to each individual definitely makes sense.
Well, you look at a lot of like the runner's world and the training that I don't mind throwing runner's world under the bus. Runner's World or My World, Trail Runner Magazine or whatever. There's always a workout du jour, right? It's always something. It's always okay. Here's the next greatest whatever workout. And I look at the every time I look at that, I always just scratch my head because you're it really is a milieu of training adaptations that you're ultimately seeking for the athlete, not just one. And so if you think that one intensity, one workout, or even a handful of intensities or workouts are really that critical, I just think that is the wrong approach to take with athletes. It takes a broad set over many months and sometimes even years to produce maximal adaptations, and to say that there's one key workout or one key intensity or whatever, I think that over trivializes the whole process.
Yeah, true. And one of the points that you talked about during the session earlier, that is that when someone is an absolute beginner, any training plan you give to that person improves. And maybe some of the names that you mentioned, maybe the plans that they give, there is higher propensity that the younger, the newer set of runners who are just getting started, they take on these plans and they improve to a certain extent, and they think this is, yeah, maybe this is the single greatest workout. But I completely agree that it has to be a lot more holistic and follow the macro cycle than just going through a daily or a weekly improvement kind of cycle. Makes absolute sense.
Here's how you can think about it though. If you're a beginner, compliance is going to correlate with success. Not how much you do, not how smart the training is, not how many whiz bang workouts you have, just compliance. We use a tool called Training Peaks. For our coaching clients, and it uses this. It's kind of a barbaric, not might not be the right word, but I'm gonna use it anyway. It's kind of they have this like kind of barbaric compliance system where they color code the days red, yellow, and green depending upon how compliant the athlete was. So if you told them to run an hour and they ran 45 minutes, it would be yellow, right? They ran an hour, it'd be green. If they didn't do anything, it'd be red. And for the beginner athletes, you just look at the green days. You've got a lot of green days, you're gonna be good. And for athletes that are just getting into the sport, the biggest piece of advice that they should kinda take to heart is follow a plan that you can stick to. It doesn't have to be the best thought out. It doesn't have to be, 500 miles a week, week 1 or any sort of like superhuman this, that, or the other. Find the one that you can stick with the most, that's the most sustainable for you long term, and let that run its course for the first year. Just give it a whole year, whatever it is, a static training program, using a coach, coming up with something on pencil and paper and sticking it up on your refrigerator, whatever that is, whatever helps your individual compliance, do that. Let it run for a year, and then after a year, think about adding something what I would call smart or intelligently designed coaching to the whole mix. If you take that approach, you're far more likely to see more success than if you're trying to search for the perfect, answer that you might not be able to stick to.
It is a great way to end the conversation. Thank you so much, Jason. This was fantastic to speak with you.
I had a fun time. Tell me what it comes out. I can't wait to listen.
All right, guys, this is all for today. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Jason. And if you liked it, and if you're liking the podcast in general, you'll do me a great favor if you just went on App Store or any of the podcast channels where you're listening this in and give us a feedback. That will help us improve, and that will keep helping us to improve and produce shows that are important for you. That is it. I look forward to speaking with you in exactly 1 week again. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. We have a lot more to offer on nutrition, training, and fitness. Check the Fitpage app or visit our website, fitpage.in.